We are in Acts chapter 11 today, and we have read through Luke's gospel, and now we are in Acts, and we've made it all the way to chapter 11. Now, leaving off from chapter 10, we notice that Paul was in Joppa with Cornelius and his family, and Paul had preached the gospel to them. The Holy Spirit had indwelt them, and Paul had stayed with them and continued to encourage them for a few days. And now we get into chapter 11, and word has reached back to Jerusalem that the gospel has come to these Gentiles. And so when Paul gets back to Jerusalem, notice that he is traveling south to get to Jerusalem, but he's still going up to Jerusalem, because you always go up to Jerusalem and you always come down from Jerusalem. That's because of Jerusalem's elevation. And it also notes it's central, that it is central in the minds of the believers. But you always go up to Jerusalem and you always come down from Jerusalem. So don't let that throw you off as you're reading through the New Testament, especially Acts and the Gospels. So these circumcised believers meet Peter. And what this means is that these are Christians who are still following the law of Moses. So they believe in Jesus, but they think that you still need to be following the Old Testament, all the Old Testament regulations as well. They're doing both. There are still people like this today. There are small groups of Christians that think that we need to get rid of all the Greek influence, even the influence of the Greek language, out of the New Testament. And we need to live kosher lifestyles, and by doing that, we come closer to God. I don't think that's a thing, but they do. I've interacted with some of them. They're nice people. Anyway, so that's what these people think. That's what Luke means when he writes circumcised. And so they're like, hey, Peter, we heard that you were eating. Now, they don't, they're not mad about the preaching. It's that Peter had fellowship with them, that he's eating, that he fully accepted them into his fellowship. That's what eating with someone signified in this culture. And so Peter is like, well, hold on a minute. And he defends his actions in the spreading of the gospel, and he recounts the story to them. He recounts the vision that he had. He recounts Cornelius' vision. He recounts the Holy Spirit coming on these Gentiles as he was preaching. And Peter's like, just like with us. And we saw that in chapter 10, that they speak in tongues when the Holy Spirit comes on them, is kind of like a second Pentecost, and that is very significant in the mind of Peter and will be significant in the minds of these Jewish believers, and it is here. That's why Peter says, it just like with it happened to us. And they're like, oh, well, okay, well, cool, then that's awesome. And so they back down, and they're like, our bad. Well, that's very, very nice. Because of Peter's recounting of what God has done, because God orchestrated all of this, and we can see that, and we can see the wisdom in that, and that Peter isn't basing this on his own authority as an apostle. He's not like, look, I'm an apostle, do what I say, be quiet. But he's like, look, God orchestrated every bit of this, because the Lord did. He sent angels. He gave visions. He made sure that all of this would be traced back to his activity, but it's still the human agents who are sharing the gospel. That is important. But we can trace it back to the Lord's activity, so that when the question arises, as it did, they're just sharing what the Lord has done. So we see that in verses 1 through 18. Then in verses 19 through 26, we get more accounts of believers who have been scattered because of this great persecution that had happened, beginning with the martyrdom of Stephen, and they've made their way to Antioch. Now, Antioch is going to be a significant location, and one of the reasons that it is significant is that traditionally Luke is tied to Antioch, and so if Christians hadn't gone to Antioch, maybe we wouldn't have Luke and Acts. But it's also the first place that Christians were called Christians. And so we get that little nugget of detail as well. Now, Antioch was about 300 miles north of Jerusalem. But you still go down from Jerusalem to go to Antioch, again, because of the elevation. But they are coming to Christ, and the church in Jerusalem hears about it, and they're like, we got to support them. And who do they send? Barnabas. Barnabas comes up again, the great encourager. He's a good man, and he's full of faith and the Holy Spirit. And so they send Barnabas as an official representative, and he goes and he sees, hey, this is awesome what's going on. And he encourages them because that's his MO. It's his thing. And then he's like, man, we need to get more people in on this. And he goes to Tarsus, and he grabs Saul, and he brings him back to Antioch. And so Saul gets in on it too, and they're all encouraging and building up the church. Now, as they're doing that, we have in verses 27 through 30, some prophets come. And this one individual named Agabus, and he says, hey, a famine is going to come. And these are famines that have been recorded in history. Famine's going to come, and so people are going to need some help. And so they're like, let's take up some donations. Let's take up a special offering, and we'll send it back down to the believers in Jerusalem. And so they do that. They take up that special offering, and then they send it with Barnabas and Saul back to the believers in Jerusalem. And we still do that today. Annie Armstrong Easter offering, Lottie Moon, Golden offering, offering for the Tennessee Baptist Children's Homes we just took up. We'll take one up for the Tennessee Baptist Adult Homes in June next month. And we still do that today. The cooperative program is an excellent example of that. Southern Baptist churches all over this nation, we give to the cooperative program so that the gospel can continue to spread throughout the world. And we're following the example that we see here in Acts. And again, this is one of those times when we're asking, is this just an example of what they did and like that was a good thing for them to do, or is this a prescriptive thing? And well, I think this churches giving to churches and churches supporting the ministry around their world is something we see woven throughout the New Testament. And so I would say that this is a prescriptive thing that we need to do that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm proud to be a Southern Baptist. Sure, we've got some not so great things in our history as Southern Baptists. But one of the things that we have done that has been good throughout is we have given. We have been generous. We have supported each other. We have supported the gospel going forth. We have supported missionaries. We have always sent people out, and we have always been dedicated and committed to giving and to helping others, realizing that it's not just about Silver Springs Baptist. When we help other churches do well, when we support missionaries, when we help other ministries, that only helps the church as a whole, and that helps the kingdom advance. And we see that we base that on the example of the first church, or the first century church, here in the book of Acts. But what about for us, other than give to special offerings? Because you should. What about for us? Well, I think for us, it's be an encourager. We see that here Barnabas is contrasted with these circumcised believers who greet Paul. Paul gets back to, or Peter gets back to Jerusalem, and they're like, whoa, what are you doing? Why did you do that? They're not like, hey, tell us about this awesome thing God is doing. They're accusing him. I mean, they change their tone. They're like, oh, our bad. But their first instinct is to be like, what you're doing isn't right. They don't want to support and build up the ministry. They initially try to tear it down, whereas Barnabas goes and he is encouraging everyone. He's pouring into everyone. He even goes to the extent to go to Tarsus and bring Saul back so that he can be a part of it too. And so Barnabas is always seeking to build others up. He's always supporting other people. He's always pouring into other people. He's always giving. He's generous. He's described as just a good man. He is always in other people's corner, and he brings refreshment with him. He's a delight. And so this is an example that we need to follow. We need to ask the Holy Spirit to make us like a Barnabas. Barnabas is a central figure. You don't get Paul, the missionary, without Barnabas. You just don't. So we need more Barnabases. We need more Barnabases. We need to make it our goal to be a Barnabas to those around us, especially now. Goodness, we're all feeling the stress. We're all feeling the prolonged, restrictions and social distancing and all this uncertainty, and the economic repercussions are continuing to mount. Like, we're all feeling this. And so we need to encourage each other even more now. And so let's seek to do that. That's a great way to apply what we've read here in Acts 11. We're reading Acts 12 tomorrow, so I'll see you then.